Hello and welcome to Quality Quest. This is a blogcast series focused on searching for the best methods and approaches to healthcare across the globe. For our first episode, we'll be covering a patient safety theme-ometer, essentially looking at how do we best improve patient safety within organisations. I'm Tom Rollinson, one of your co-hosts, and I'll be joined by Dr. Aklak Choudhury, our other co-host as well. Let's get into it.
You notice by the title, I've put theme in red intentionally. So we're kind of been used to what's called a patient safety thermometers, where we're measuring patient safety through quality assurance. But for me, it's not quite capturing what we really need to do in reality. And I've just coined a term there, theme-ometer, rather than a thermometer. And I'm just going to start with that quote there. So the identification of problems will not be seen as a sign of individual or collective failure, but a sign of readiness to learn. And I just have to reflect on that a bit, actually, what that really means. It means that we're not looking for things that are necessarily wrong, and then finishing and stopping there and say, we've identified this problem. That sometimes we do with root cause analysis. We're actually more interested to work out what's underlying it, and it's probably multifactorial as well. It links in really well with the stuff that's come out from NHS England in terms of the patient safety review in 2019, where we've got patient safety incident reporting framework, or PSIRF, and they kind of focus on looking at the systems. And they're also quite interested to look at how often things happen in the same area and doing a measured response. So it's a kind of a concept that is being developed. Unfortunately, I think one of the problems is that we still got our old, shall we say, IT systems that kind of run in the background that have been designed maybe 15, 20 years ago that look at datexes in a kind of root cause analysis way, try to find a specific issue to fix it, until something else comes along and you have to fix that as well. So that's my sort of starter for 10. And if you could just go to the next slide, that'd be good.
Yeah, of course. And just whilst we're there as well, Aklak. So
Yeah.
what problem is this trying to fix? I suppose, like, is there a gap that you found? So, because I'm not really familiar with this type of patient safety approach. So what's the problem at the moment, and what is this sort of framework aiming to improve?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess it's trying to establish a slightly different way of looking at our data. And I think that's quite important. So when somebody puts in an incident request form through Datex, for example, they will explain exactly what happened at the incident and then kind of almost say, over to you. Somebody else has to go and do the legwork to try and find out what's happening, and which is a bit of a shame because they're the ones involved in the incident and they've seen it happen. And we want to get to a place where people start learning. And for me, it's about humans. Humans naturally make errors. It's part of our makeup, and often the systems that we work in help to create those errors. So what we really want to do is move away from the individual data items that are in silos and try to build a sort of, shall we say, an overall picture of incidents, but not the incident itself, but the learning themes associated with it, which I don't think we do very well at this moment in time. And that's part of the reason why we can't get to the place where we'd like to improve. So I think hopefully it will get a bit clearer as we do the presentation. Oh, you've got my cogs up already, so that's good.
Yeah.
But there's a bit missing there, isn't there? So we'll have a look.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, stick them all up.
4?
That's it. Absolutely, yeah. So I was trying to turn it into some kind of van or some kind of very futuristic machine, but I managed to just about pull off 3 cogs and different nice shaped sort of thing, triangles and squares with different colors in it. But I was kind of trying to see whether there is a format for this and try to make it come alive. And I'm going to go through each of these, but essentially there may be more. And I think this is part of it. This is a concept rather than any principle that everyone's got to go home and just say, right, it's all finished and done. But the 4 that I'm going to focus on is the aspect of looking at qualitative data and how to make sense of it. So this is not about numbers necessarily, it's how do we make sense of qualitative data. And we can take stuff from our, shall we say, research when we do qualitative data and take some of those principles. One of the things that we don't do very well is triangulate that information to create learning themes across sources. So, for example, we have qualitative data from friends and family testing. We have qualitative data from patient safety incidents, learning from deaths. It goes on, coroner's inquest, and we'll touch on this. And then this one, which I think is the trickiest bit, is how do we, shall we say, prioritize that information? And we'll talk about, you might have guessed there might be a Pareto chart there, but it's a bit more than that. And perhaps the most important aspect, which I think in organizations we haven't quite got right yet, is how do we share incidents that have caused learning themes to other parts of your organization or even wider in a systematic way so that we can focus on our improvements. Does that kind of make a bit of sense? We'll go through the bit of the detail. I don't think I've missed out any shapes. I guess the last shape is about, well, what does that mean for improvement? And we'll probably touch on that as well.
Yeah, and super simple question from my side of stuff, but you've got an arrow there, but is that a linear fashion you would do this in that sort of order? Like it's not just random tools, but there is a specific order that you would do one after the other.
Yeah, great question. So I think the coding definitely should come first. Now, you might argue that you might want to, shall we say, prioritize locally first, using the Prioritising, and then triangulate later. But I think if you get all your sources of information in the department at the right time, which is at the beginning, you will make much more sense of your local picture so that you know that your, shall we say, issues with incidents causing learning themes matches up with what's happening for a learning from death or a complaint. And say, and that gives it more emphasis. And then you will put everything through the next stage, which is a Prioritising. So the value of that is that it allows, I would say, not to having too many data sets floating around, not to have too many siloed data sets. Also, my incidents are telling me this. My learning from death is telling me this. Which one do I believe? People have made the effort to try and make sense of it before it goes out to the wider organization. But I think it's something that perhaps needs a bit of working through. But at the moment, I think that's probably the order I go to. But I can explain the other way around as well if I had to, with the yellow box going second.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And you're probably going to get to it as well. But like, what actually happens now? Because you mentioned about the codometer and the triangulometer.
Yeah.
But kind of with those different sources of information, sort of where they exist and how that informs improvement. But I suppose, I don't know whether you'll get into that next.
We will do. So there's been a huge change of emphasis in terms of PSURF and looking at the system as a whole and looking at incidents as a whole. At the moment, what's happening is that a fall happens, let's just say, on a ward. We decide that there's some incidents related to having the sides up on the bed. There was some water on the floor and so forth. And then there's a kind of an incident response to that specific incident. If you're lucky, you might get a learning theme, but it's not necessarily there. And then another fall happens 2 weeks later with almost similar things, but there's been no attempt to put it together. There's also very little attempt to look at underlying problems as well that might be slightly deeper. So what's a slightly deeper problem that often isn't picked up on just the incident report? Let's say handover. Okay. So unless you really read and understand and interview the people involved and do some further analysis, okay, of the system that they're working in, you will not necessarily pick up those kind of deeper problems. To say, you know what, there seems to be an issue with respiratory not talking to cardiology that week. I can't see any entries there, but that wasn't picked up on the initial incident. We know that when it comes to PSURF, there's a kind of a number of things that we want to do. So at the center, there are our patients and our staff. In terms of what else we need to do is just to basically work out how the organization has set itself up, what the internal parameters are, what the tasks are related, and so forth. And then only then when we get to the process and the outcomes. So it's a kind of a pathway, but we need to get that bit right. Writing down the incident on its own is not enough. It's everything else that comes with it, that system approach. So here we are. There's a bit of text for you, just so that everyone picks this up. And apologies that you may not be in the medicine field and so forth, and apologies to the audience. But I think it just gives a feel of what qualitative data could look like for you to decide and delve into. So a 59-year-old male was admitted for a urinary tract infection. This was adequately treated in the medical assessment unit. He is known to have severe debilitating Parkinson's disease, which causes rigidity and tremor and slowness of movements, as well as epilepsy, and for which he is on regular treatment. So although these medications were prescribed on the electronic prescribing system, there was a delay in ordering and arrival of Parkinson's and epilepsy medications onto the ward that could have led to worsening of his swallowing difficulties, especially with the Parkinson's medications. He then unfortunately suffered a seizure and vomited on day 3 of his admission. He was treated for aspiration pneumonia. He responded poorly to treatment and began to struggle with his breathing. After discussion with the family, a decision was made to palliate him and good end-of-life care was given. The delay in medication delivery was discussed openly with the family and an apology was offered. He passed away peacefully 2 days later with his family by his bedside. So that's a succinct summary of, obviously these reports will be a bit longer than this, but I just wanted to pick up something that is sort of manageable for the purposes of the blog. Anything that strikes you, Tom? Anything about that case that you kind of think could have done better or differently?
I suppose not being medical, and just taking what the information on the screen, it seems like there was a delay in terms of that time dependent, those time dependent drugs to a certain extent as well. I suppose apart from what's on the screen here, I suppose what you've got there is actually quite a succinct summary of what happened, and I suppose this is part of a much longer report and set of patient notes that you'd normally have. So even getting to this summary is quite a lot of work. So and that type of stuff as well. So that was one of the things that struck me initially, which is that you wouldn't get this straight away. This would be a result of somebody going in and reviewing all the notes and stuff like that. Probably many hours of work to get to this summary to begin with. But in answering your question, I think that it seems that there was a delay in terms of that medication from that sort of things. Again, just on the face value.
Thanks, Tom. Again, really valid point. So this wouldn't be just coming from the incident request form. There would have been some huddles. In PSURF, we sometimes call these swarms or after action reviews, where we get the team together to try and find out a bit more about what's happened. And we try to do these as soon as we can after the incident to get some more information. Loads of different teams involved, sometimes we do a multidisciplinary team effort to get everyone in the same room if it involves a different speciality, for example. And the more serious ones, we go ahead and do a patient safety incident investigation. So you're absolutely right. So this would be a summary of a case that's gone through some of that process. So if you want to just go forward with the
next one.
You should highlight some of the right. Okay. And again, great. So I think you're spot on. So there's some delaying in the ordering of the Parkinson's and epilepsy medications, and we can just put that as a potential, shall we say, code at this stage. Or and there's another one which is the worsening of his swallowing difficulties, and then there was a consequence to that with the seizure and vomiting. So let's just try and code that. But there's 2 elements here. There's the Parkinson's medication, but there was also an issue with the epilepsy one because he had a seizure as well and then vomited.
Yeah.
But they're the kind of they're slightly red because I would say they're the ones. Negative is a bad word, but let's just try room for improvement. Okay, yeah. So they're the current challenges, but there's also examples of potentially good care there. Okay, so if you see at the yellow bit, good end of life care was given. The delay in medication delivery was discussed openly with the family and an apology offered. So there was good evidence of duty of candour as well at the time by the clinical team, not waiting for the whole incident to complete. So people are showing some of the correct behaviours when it comes to telling families what's happened, what's gone wrong, sending apology, but also what we're doing about it. So I think that's really important. So at the moment, though, it's still words with a highlighter pen, isn't it? So
yeah,
we moved a bit, but not quite to where we need to go. And we are now starting our process of coding formally. So first thing we need to do is familiarize ourselves with the information, which we've done, and now we've attempted to put some codes in. If you go to the next one.
And typically, Aklak, once you've got a summary like that, would you jump directly to improvement on the back of that? So you'd say, oh, there's a delay in medication, so we need to do something specifically about how we ensure medications are given earlier on the pathway. Is that what would happen rather than the theming of them?
So it very much depends on the risk for that in terms of the risk matrix. So if, for example, even if it doesn't happen very often, but the consequences to the staff or patients is very severe, we would do an immediate change of practice for those. But for the vast majority, I would say that isn't the case. This is much more about the learning and the reflection that comes along with it. So hopefully we can get to that place when we start talking about the triangulation. But otherwise, what we will do is kind of essentially play a not very good game of whack-a-mole if we just react to every single incident. It takes up a lot of human resources, takes up a lot of time, creates a lot of paperwork. And in fact, one of the things that PSURF is now saying is that we need to have, shall we say, a measured response to incidents and not just go full-on root cause analysis for every single one. So we may, for example, say, you know what, in this case, or maybe a separate case which is less severe, let's say a fall like we said before, right, this is the 5th fall in our area in the last 2 months. We've already got information from improvement and learning from the other 4. Has this fall helped us to understand the problem any better? And if so, can we add that? And then we can close it. The only other thing that we will need to do is obviously just still talk to the family and let them know what's happened.
Yeah, of course.
But it's a slightly different conversation. It will be much more along the lines of, I'm sorry your elderly father's had a fall on the ward. Unfortunately, this is not the first time this has happened on our ward. We've already got an improvement piece of work going on. The issues with the fall are currently being addressed, and here's some of the work that we're doing. In terms of your father's case, this is the learning that we will put towards that program. So it's a completely separate and different conversation to the ones, I'm really sorry your father's fallen over, and we'll try not to make it happen again. So it tells people that you're kind of trying to do the right thing. It's not great that someone's fallen over, and they might ask, well, how comes you haven't sorted it out yet? But we know in the complex systems, things are not always that easy to just fix it tomorrow. And there may be a few human factors and other things that will stop these things from happening, and all the system things that we talked about.
Yeah.
So if we go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So this is a little table, and you can have this table as big or as small as you want. But one of the things I'm always very keen on is not to have too many data sets. This data set is basically taken from that initial coding. So we've generated some codes here, as you can see. And you can have a look at the first 2, which looks at epilepsy medications did not arrive on time, and Parkinson's medication did not arrive on time. They're 2 separate medications. You might say, why don't we just lump them together? Well, there may be different issues with the epilepsy medication that we're not aware of, and so at this stage, probably not. But we can group them, and this is a group. You can have groups that are what we call emergent themes. So no one's actually found this group before, and they're going to create this group, or we can put them into something that's already a fixed theme. So we know critical drug medication errors happen commonly in hospitals, and this would fit that remit. The last column there is saying that our basically, is it a kind of a positive or a negative theme? Yeah. So positive basically mean this is something that is showing good or excellent care, where a negative theme is an area for improvement. Okay, if we want to put it in those kind of terms. And you can see the two at the bottom, so I'm not going to go through in detail, but you can see that the end of life care discussions and the duty of candor discussions were both positive themes, as you can see. But that's kind of the thematic information. But there are other key bits of data which I think are going to be really important for triangulation in the future, and you can see them at the bottom. You know, the hospital number, where the ID for this information come from. Is it a patient safety incident? Is it learning from deaths or somewhere else? The location and the date and the time of the event and the specialty, because things may be different at night, things may be different on the weekend. And so it's really important to collate that information. And also, you know, which hospital, which specialty is it happening? Is it really focused in one area more than the other? Is it that something's happening in surgery, like Parkinson's medication delays, but also unknown to medicine, they do their own bit and they find the same problem over there. So it's an opportunity to say, oh, hang on a minute, this is not just us. There's other places in the hospital that have got the same issue. And it will make that conversation and that improvement come alive, because you're not just focusing on your little silo anymore. You're going to try and get people together to make this something that will meaningfully give improvement. And ultimately, this is kind of what we would normally call a quality management system, if you like. If you see that principle, you know, we're going to try and understand from our quality assurance through our themes and then improve, but make sure those improvements are scaled to the right proportion. So
I suppose my question would be as well, so this would need to be a organisationally led approach, wouldn't it? It couldn't just be something which is sprung up within respective areas. So it would be, you know, patient safety within an organisation. Would you, with the themes as well, because I suppose that's something which would need to be collated. Would that need to be collated centrally as well? Because I suppose that, you know, even with this one, medication error, you know, if you just looked at that at the face value, it might be that somebody gave the wrong medication, but actually from what I'm reading there, it's not necessarily the wrong medication, it's just it didn't even arrive on time, or like it wasn't ordered, or whatever that was. So kind of the themes around that, and kind of the I suppose the organizational approach, that this would need to be organizational, but also as well the themes which are aligned to each of the initial themes identified in the summaries.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It does. Okay, so this has to be led almost at an executive level, and definitely in the patient safety forums. So we will need to decide what our, shall we say, what our group themes are in general. How we're going to collect this within the governance structure. Okay, and to make sure that as we go up the organization, from staff to department to business unit to division to corporate, that's fully aligned, and at each stage they will check their local information regarding themes. They will then transfer their themes to the level up, and then collate from a wider group, and then go up and collate even wider. So we're almost getting to that place where we can have a, shall we say, an overview and an oversight of what our learning themes are in an organization. At the moment, people are just doing very different things, and most people don't necessarily theme that well and do the coding very well. So there's a degree of training that's required for this as well. So unless you've done lots of qualitative data analysis, this is not something that comes naturally. But I also don't think it's that difficult either, with some really basic principles. Because remember, everyone's going to be doing this is very likely to come from a patient safety quality background or a clinician, so they understand the virtues of doing this. It's just that we haven't practiced it.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, so if we go to step 2. Okay, so we talked a bit about this, didn't we? About triangulating sources. This is by no means a complete list of all potential patient safety sources of information, but they are ones that give us the qualitative data, I would say the major ones in our organization. Now, it might surprise you to know that incident reporting frameworks, in terms of who manage them in the background, are mostly clinical governance facilitators, often from a nursing background, or nurses themselves. Doctors don't tend to get involved, and nor do any other wider sort of clinical group particularly. structured judgment reviews, which is the kind of qualitative response to a death that we sometimes do. Say, for example, if there was a concern or worry about a death, that's often done by doctors. Patient complaints, again, a huge source of information done by patient experience teams. Coroner's inquests, that goes external and the coroner gives a report back. And then friends and family comments, again, patient experience, manage those groups as well. So it does vary depending where we are. Now, we just had that conversation, didn't we, about how do we put this all together? So if you look at step 2 now, let's say the department is respiratory medicine, they're all your potential sources of themes. And
is that all of them? That's exhaustive.
It's not, well, there may be other things. I'm just trying to think some off the top of my head, but I think they're the big ones. There may be anecdotal information. There may be stuff from audit, for example, which I haven't included here. Okay, that we haven't reached the benchmark, and there's some themes of learning that have come from an audit that we need to focus on. There's other things such as get it right first time, and they might find some safety issues and so forth. There'll be other things such as walkarounds or walkabouts by teams, and they've identified specific problems when they've done the walkabout. So it's quite a long list, but what I would say to you is that these are the kind of standard data sets that are common to most organizations. That's not to say you can't include all of the other things as well, but it's got to be manageable to some degree. So you may need to prioritize which learning themes you want to put through this. Ideally, you want them all, don't you? So, and then it goes through a triangulating. So the triangulating it's nothing too fancy. It's not some kind of spaced out machine that does fancy things. All it really does is basically looks at themes and say, yep, that theme is also in mortality and is also in friends and family comments, or that theme is in datex and patient complaints, and then tries to emphasize this. It's really important, this, because if we don't triangulate, we'll have slightly different information from different sources. And it's, let's say structured judgment reviews. The person's died, sadly. Now, people who have died may have slightly different types of incidents to people who have survived. And unless you collect that datex information, it's there. I'm not sure if you remember the example from black box thinking with the plane.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
So if we can say the plane. So these planes flew across the ocean and only some came back and there was bullet marks on the plane. Okay. And those bullet marks were kind of on the wings, and certain other areas like the wheels and so forth. Okay, and that's a patient safety incident, if you like. But what the marks were not where the pilot sat or the engine. Yeah. And that's because all of those who had bullet marks there, went into the ocean and the plane was lost.
Never got back.
So absolutely. So it's just about trying to make sure that every single source of information is slightly different. So, for example, friends and family comments. Well, exactly what it is. So it's not the patient. The patient may be too unwell to tell you how terrible things are, but the families aren't. And they are seeing it, observing it by sitting next to the bedside. So the triangulation is not just about collecting information, but also making sure that we've got a good scope of information from different sources.
So just to take that analogy further, so I suppose that's a really good example from black box thinking, which was that the planes that made it home from one of the world wars were the ones that weren't damaged enough. So as a result, I think essentially they had a lot of damage to the body of the plane, if I remember right. And so what they did as a result of that, they just armor plated the body. But actually, the fatal damage to the planes was usually when it hit the wings. And so essentially, they thought that the wings were absolutely fine, but those planes were actually going down. So to take that analogy further, I suppose that you could say that this is the data that you've captured, but there's a whole host of data that you haven't captured as well, which hasn't quite made its way back to you. So I suppose, how do you account for that information that doesn't make you back to you? Is it through that sort of anecdote and qualitative feedback, walkarounds, further discussions?
Yeah.
Or do you just use this as this is as much as we know for the time being and building it over time?
So ideally, the walkarounds, depends who's doing the walkaround. So if it's a walkaround by the team leader and somebody local, then that's fine. But if it's a walkaround from someone quite senior, you don't really want a senior person to come around and say, this is wrong, this is right, this is this could be better and so forth, because actually that should be coming from your staff because they see the problems every day. Sorry. So what I would say is that those sources of information are kind of sense checks rather than a core part of what you're doing. It's just to make sure that what we've got here is a true reflection of what's happening. Okay,
yes.
And if you say, oh, actually, you know what, that doesn't make any sense. No one's talked about this at all. So why does this keep coming up as an incident? And you might find it's always the same person who doesn't like doing night shifts or something like that. So, you know, whatever it is.
We all know them.
Yeah, so that's right. So it's just about just making sure that there is some sense checking, which can be done. But in terms of the standard working, we need to be looking at this as our standard work of making sure that themes happen.
And in terms of the triangulometer, is that a person? Is that a process? Is that, you know, a spreadsheet? What does that look like practically in terms of how you would gather all that information?
So although I'm not a great fan of spreadsheets, it may end up as a spreadsheet, but it's a process. So the idea is that you will go through each of those, pick out the themes, and you'd almost create a matrix of that theme and say, right, has that in that matrix, you know, like a square box with lots of smaller boxes in it, and you've got top and the bottom, and you've got all your different triangulating sources at the top and the themes at the bottom, and you just put a tick as to how many times has that same issue caused a problem in Datex, SJRs, patient complaints, and so forth. And if it's done all 5, then clearly that's something that needs a bit of attention. Now, it doesn't mean to say that if it's only tick 1, it's not important, but it gives more, shall we say, emphasis to that area that we need to focus on. And especially if you think about that process, it's worrying, isn't it? So say, for example, people have complained and there's incidents related to that issue, say lack of getting Parkinson's medication. And then there's structured judgment reviews of people dying of that problem. Yeah. Then we know that as a culture, to remove the system problems, we haven't quite done it, have we? We've kind of got to a place where we're collecting the information but not acting on it to reduce the risk of both the incidents and the deaths. So it doesn't just tell you about where it's happening, but also about our response and are we genuinely getting better? You know, there is no coming back from death. So we need to make sure that all the other things help and reduce that risk over time, and that's partly through improvement work. So this is the one I've struggled with, Tom, to be honest, and I wasn't quite sure whether this is like the best version of this. So Pareto, we all know, in terms of its process there, and we're looking at the vital few, or the top 80%. And in this sort of fictional case, we've got falls, critical medication errors, and limited duty of candor as a theme name in that department. But there's a whole bunch of other things as well. So although we can quantify the, shall we say, the grouped themes, is it enough? For example, if you get a never event, in an organization, and should that then have its own priority that's separate to this? And it's only as good also as the people who are putting these things on the system. So for example, falls and pressure ulcers surprisingly come up as incidents all across the NHS. And it's not because people have a thing for falls and pressure ulcers. I think people are very passionate about it, but it's mandated by most organisations that we need to collect whether pressure ulcers change from one to another and falls, because they're just so common and they're usually part of a, shall we say, a wider piece of work to improve that pathway. But the slightly more challenging things, and often doctors are in this group, the handovers, some of the medication error problems, issues within surgery, they don't come up as often. And I think that's partly because of the culture as well. So simply using a prioritometer may not always give you all the information, but just gives you a snapshot of what we might end up focusing on to help and support with themes.
And is that because you would say that people don't recognise that? So clear, I suppose it's the cause and effect, isn't it? So just again, not being clinical, but if a patient has been lying in a bed for a certain amount of time, and that's led to a pressure ulcer, actually the cause and effect is quite apparent, isn't it? So this could have been avoided, and it's well documented. We understand that. However, when that cause and effect is slightly more loose, so say for example that as a result of trying to reduce falls, that patients are kept in beds, although that you reduce the fall, that actually that patient deconditions over time. So actually, that patient is still coming to harm. However, the action of what you did and the impact of what occurred is slightly decoupled. But it's still, that patient is still potentially coming to harm. They're potentially deconditioning. They're not going back to home. They go back to a care home instead. So I suppose is it the recognition of what actually harm is, and kind of what the impact of the action that you had versus the impact that it's having on the patients potentially as well.
No, that's spot on, Tom. I think you're right. So some things are very easy to put an incident form in for. Other things, you remember we talked about looking at the codes and trying to delve a bit deeper, try to understand it a bit more. So some of these things you won't, on the first read, you may not pick it up. So, for example, not everyone would have picked up in that example about the good end of life care as a positive theme, and they won't have recorded it because they're not looking for it. And it's up to us as an organization to get that focus, that people go a bit deeper with the codes, not just take things at face value and say, you know what, there might be something else there that hasn't been picked up either by the person putting the incident or anyone else that I've seen that is an issue. Usually due to communication, usually due to handover. It's not to say that these things are not picked up on incidents, but they're not as often as they could be, because we just think it's just part of the mix of being in a busy system, complicated area, that, there's always communication issues, but if we don't fix them, it will happen again. And I think for us, trying to get those learning themes out is really important. So that generating of codes is a skill. It's a bit of an art that takes a bit of time and practice, but I do think it's something that's important. And currently, perhaps, certain silos are probably doing this okay, but I don't think it's inherent within the NHS organisation as a whole.
Yeah, and I suppose related to this Prioritising here as well, I suppose they're related to the things that went wrong, but you've already spoken about is the positive themes as well. So, rather than root cause analysis, what's the right cause analysis? So actually, when do things go effectively well? So end of life care, or actually debriefing, those type of themes as well. Which again, I suppose you could have two of them rather than going let's not just all focus on the negative stuff. How do we do more of the good stuff as well? Yeah,
no, you're right, and we tend to be slightly sort of focused on the errors, aren't we? If something good happens, it's great. Oh, that was really good, wasn't it? But do we put an incident form in for that, in terms of that, like grey text or something like that? So certain organisations have gone down the grey text route, but isn't that part of what we should be doing? Why don't we do it? It's not because we don't want to do it. It's because there's other things and other priorities, and time is a very precious commodity. And again, it goes back to our culture of sharing good practice and shared learning of good practice, not shared learning necessarily of all the things that didn't happen well, but you say, hey, this department does fantastically well in terms of processing their outpatient patients in a timely manner and reducing waiting times. How do we share that? And those themes also need to come up, because if I find that there's a shared theme that is positive of excellence in outpatients management of their patients in a timely manner, I might go to that department and say, how do you do it? I want to know. If we don't do it, we won't know. So I think it's just as important, if not more important, than to get this right. So it's all about this patient safety 1 and 2. I'm not going to go into it, but there's a lot of elements of that.
There we go.
Okay. So we kind of probably discussed this, haven't we, in a way, about where we're going to get to. So this is a graphical view of what it might be like if a department comes and sees what's going on in terms of these themes. Now, the usual way this happens is through an Excel spreadsheet, which is absolutely unmanageable and no one can really read it. Here, what we're trying to show is, first of all, not just your department, but how do you compare to your peers for these themes? The size of the circle is how often it happens, and also separate them into perhaps negative and positive themes as well. And if, for example, you've had issues, let's say you're the medical assessment unit and you've got issues with critical medication error, you'd probably go to the gastroenterology wards and find out what their problems are, either the same or different, and maybe go to theatres in general surgery who have less of them and ask them why. Okay, so this is a kind of visualization, and in its reality, what would happen is that you could individually click on those circles, and then it will hone down on the specific themes, and then you click on it again, it will hone down on the actual theme itself, as well as where it happened, what time of day and night, and so forth. So anyone externally can have a look at this. So this is not data coming to you. This is you as your staff member saying, oh, let me have a look at what's going on my Shareometer to see where we are with these things. And so it will define your management and care of those patients. So I think for me, this should be something very visible, very intuitive, easy to click through, and easy on the eye as well. So what you don't want is heavy data sets that you really can't make head or tail of. It's slightly different to a business information portal, where again you get the numbers, you can look at the numbers, but this is just kind of the bigger picture, so that you know that if somebody asks you, particularly the CQC, so what are the issues in gastroenterology ward 1? Oh, here are falls, critical medication errors, and limited duty of candor, and then you will then be able to describe that process from there on. So just a thought there. This is about shared learning. It's by no means the only shared learning that you can do, but it's the bit that kind of is also slightly missing.
I suppose, who is this for? Is this for? Is it for staff at the front line? Is it for managers? Is it for clinical staff? Is it for everybody? I suppose who is this mainly for? Would you say?
So this is something that should be very prominent on your, shall we say, your trust website. That is just literally one click away from your homepage. So it's for all staff. So in a sense, what we're trying to do here is make shared learning part of your daily work. So you can basically say, you can get email notifications as well. But as you can imagine, you may, as somebody who works in gastroenterology, maybe just focus on your gastroenterology bit, but it wouldn't take very much to find out the other stuff as well. But the next level up, division and corporate, they'd be really up on this as well. Not to basically say, hey, you need to do better on X, Y, and Z, but just to also have an overview about where things are working well and where things are not, and how, shall we say, widespread this theme is in your organization. So I think something that's very visual, very easy to navigate, and quite clear in terms of what the next steps are, would be really helpful. It doesn't tell you what to improve, but it just gives you an idea of what your problems are, because we all want harm-free care, ultimately, and we want to share our really good work, and we've got to have something that is going to be able to show that in a nice and easy, straightforward way.
And this is a snapshot, isn't it? So I suppose from that side of stuff, how would you show improvement? Because I suppose, would it be that the circle gets smaller over time potentially, or is it that we'd have a supplementary run chart, or what would that be? Because I suppose you wouldn't want that to be static forever, because things hopefully would change over time.
So I think it's just a case of how mature the process is. So if departments are putting in themes every day, this would be prospective. If it's every week, it'll be less prospective, and it'll be a snapshot of the week before. So it very much depends on that. It's more of a time thing. But what I would expect, for example, if someone's put their snapshot of data in the medical assessment unit, those circles will change in size appropriately almost immediately. So that's the idea. And also it's great, isn't it? If you had a big circle for falls and it's got smaller, that's something that you can share. It's like, hey, my circle's got smaller, and to the point that it almost disappears. But something else might prop up. So it's a kind of a live way of keeping things going. It does take a lot of coordination, and the challenges with this is about our data sources and where they're being held. So there are companies that run Datex, there are companies that do structured judgment reviews, but overall we need to extract that data into a central data warehouse so that we can create these reports. But we need to have a consistent approach of how we get to the themes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So okay. Right?
Yeah, great.
So we talked a bit about these things. So this is a concept, and I expect that a few others will have some thoughts regarding this. I think one of the things that we mustn't forget is that we're looking at themes and coding. One thing I haven't touched upon, because it's beyond the scope of this, is about the human element. It's about how do we reach that place that we want to go to, about creating the just learning culture. Okay, so it's beyond there. So we need to be really clear that it is absolutely okay for humans to make errors. Okay, because we work in complex systems, and us as leaders need to make sure that we show those behaviors, that we understand that ourselves, and then hopefully we can get to a place of learning and improvement. So if we don't have that culture, none of this will work. I think for me, it's underpinned by that just learning culture. So we've got to work on that as well. And if you don't have the just learning culture, no one's going to do any of this, really, are they? They're not going to do the coding for a start. So
so data is used as a punitive tool, isn't it, to a certain extent? And it's, I've definitely been in a situation where people have used that as a bit of a stick. So I want to datax that person. Whereas, I've had friends who I've spoken about before who are like pilots in the aviation industry, and from their side of stuff, they see the equivalent of a datex as that's just part of their learning. So it's like, oh well, I'm going to put a report in there just because we don't want that to happen again. So it's a really small change, but it's like it's seeing it as punitive versus seeing it as learning is a really key part of that. But I think it's changing that culture and the reprimand around it as well. So if a datex gets put in, like the consequence of that is that you have to go through this process whereby people poke holes in what you did and what you didn't do, as the case may be. So I suppose it's not just changing culture sounds easy. Oh, we'll just change the culture, but actually that's a set of behaviour, set of mindset, set of responses that we need to sort of subtly tweak as well, to away from being individual responsibility and accountability to actually what happened as a system there from that sort of stuff. So that's my sort of thought on it. How do we change that response around and thoughts around issues?
It's tricky. I think some of it is going to be picked up in the PSURF work, but the problem with PSURF is it doesn't really go and talk about the strategy of that just learning culture. It doesn't. It tells you about the systems that you should be working in and what we should aspire to, but how do you change that just learning culture? So there's good work outside NHS, such as Human Organizational Performance, or HOP, which comes from the energy industry, started in nuclear energy, that goes into a lot of this detail about learning teams. And I think we can learn quite a bit about that from other organizations, about how they approach the learning aspect. And you can be coached to be a better both learner, but also be a better response to somebody who's senior, to talk to the staff about, right, this has happened. What did we learn from it? What are we going to do, and how are we going to manage this from here on in? So a completely different conversation rather than the slightly more scary one of you did that mistake, didn't you? Okay, you go and fix it. All right.
Yeah.
Don't do it again. So that's the worst kind of behavior pattern, but there's a lot of in between as well. So I think probably one for another blog, but we just wanted to make that really clear. But what we're trying to do today, I think, is just more about just trying to pin down some steps that are sometimes not there. I'm not saying none of them are there, but they're sometimes not done in the right order, or they're kind of triangulated at the wrong time. And shared learning, I think, is one of our weakest points in healthcare. We don't do the shared learning as well as we could. And part of that is because of our governance structures. They haven't quite gone to the right place. But if you've got good governance structures that report appropriately and share across divisions and departments, you've got fantastic opportunity to do shared learning. But because the structures are not quite where they need to be, we haven't got there yet. Again, a tricky one, this one, focusing improvements. So let's imagine that shared learning that we've got, the heat map one with the different circles. We've got to that place. So, some utopia that has got this there. But that's just one bit, isn't it? There's quite a few other things that we need to focus on. So our organizations have a number of trust priorities. And hopefully, if it's a mature organization, some of those trust priorities would have come from the shared learning from the previous year. Okay, but there may be top 10 things, for example, focus on the ED target. focus on reducing the pressure sores. So there will need to be a bit of alignment with what the organization is also thinking that is their focus at the time. And they're not necessarily related to shared learning. It could be from a CQC report, if you see what I'm saying. So there may be external factors that cause priorities. Yeah. And then we mentioned this briefly, but aligning with national audits and NICE guidance priorities as well. So if there's been a new piece of research that is now standard practice, NICE will create a document, and then that department will then need to see where they are against that NICE guidance and do they need to do a piece of work for that. So that won't necessarily come through shared learning priority hotspots. That will be its own piece of work. And then putting all of that together, we might be able to then create some priority improvement work. Now, one of the things I would say to you is that it's really important that this doesn't feel corporate, and there's a risk that it could do. The shared learning priority hotspots should be owned by the teams, and aligning the trust priorities is not a case of you must do all of these priorities, but out of those priorities, is there anything that basically, you connect with? I say, right, yeah, priority 2 and priority 4 are issues with us, so I'm going to focus on those two. So you don't need to do everything. And the guidelines and audits, they should be relevant to your department, not every audit or guideline. So it's still got a relevance to the department, but by no means is it the only thing that factors in this. And we know about quality improvement, isn't it? Is to give people closest to the problem the permission to go and do improvement work. What we don't want to do is give them a list of things to do. So we've got to be very careful about it.
Yeah. And I think when you mention about priorities as well, that's something which I've been especially cognizant of over the last 12 months to 2 years, really, which is how you don't necessarily, when you have 50 priorities, you have no priorities, you just have a list of things to do. So how do you prioritize, but how also do you pause other pieces of work, and how do you make that acceptable from an organizational perspective, but also a scrutiny perspective as well? So you've mentioned about trust priorities, but also external priorities as well, which are enforced onto the respective trusts. So ultimately, if you are using this data-driven approach and you've identified your improvement, prioritize those things, how is it best that leaders allow for other pieces of work to be paused?
So I think it's really difficult, isn't it? I think the departments and the divisions will have their priorities as well. Ideally, in the right culture, all of these areas will work almost by themselves, but they will feed back corporately. I think the function of corporate and to some degree divisional is to make sure those pathways are aligned. That's it. So I wouldn't necessarily go as a corporate person knowing that there's a very well-functioning department that have already picked up what their local priorities are, and off you go. If, however, there is something that is a CQC, for example, and we've got to do something because we're being externally reported, even that has to be approached in the right way. So say, look, excellent, you're doing this work, but this is something that we have to report across the organization on. It may not be such an issue, but we just need that report back, and just make sure that it's not a theme. Now, if you're doing all of this stuff and you've got your learning themes and you're collecting all of this stuff, that return would be pretty quick because you've already got the information there. No, we don't have any themes on this in our department in the last year. Yeah. That's it. If you don't have that stuff, then you have to then create an audit or do something else to find that information. So it's about that bit about quality control, if you like, having that information to hand prospectively when we need it, rather than waiting for some ask from seniors. So there will be times we all face it. You need that report by yesterday, but hopefully with this process, this will get better and better. So that actually what you might end up sharing is those circles to say, look, this is our organization.
Yeah, but it goes back to the Pareto, doesn't it, to a certain extent, which is that you don't, even though you might have you have just say 20 themes, but only 5 of those might contribute to 80% of it. So there's no point focusing on all 20. That actually you should focus on the smaller few, which will have the greatest impact. And I suppose that's the same for any piece of improvement work. You don't want to have a piece of improvement work across all of your issues, really, because you're spreading your resource too thinly, and actually you'll get the the square root of FA, just in terms of the amount of work that you actually managed to do and that impact that you had. So it's kind of how do you create that culture, how do you create that empowerment within the teams to kind of go, no, these are your priorities, and actually you need to focus on these for the time being, and once we see some level of improvement, we can look at actually whether we focus on some other areas as well.
Difficult, I think, isn't it? I think that's a journey over time. I think there's got to be trust, and understanding that we've given you the opportunity and the permission to do this work, both collecting the learning themes and the improvement. And then what I would say, a consistency of approach. There's something called catchballing, where essentially as you go up the ladder, you sense check at the next level. It said, have we got the data the right way that we both expect it to be? Have we captured the learning themes? Oh, you don't seem to be having any learning themes coming from structured judgment reviews. Is there a reason for that? They said, no, we're just delayed for a week. It will come. So it's just that making sure that you're sense checking at the next level up, that we're doing the right things for that organization performance to there. And ultimately, what is trust is people getting to do their work. And then reporting to you without being asked to some degree, and things are working because they get there. There will always be challenges, and there will always be things that we will need to always correct on. But I think there is no reason, with all the staff that we have, and quite a number of staff that are involved with quality and safety, that we can't develop this process. So I'm kind of trying to sell a slight vision here in terms of how we should do the data. It's not the complete answer, because I've talked about just culture being part of this, but it's a big step to try and say, okay, at least this is a template that we can try and build stuff around, which kind of makes sense. So I've talked to some of my colleagues in my own organization about this, and overall they seem, this makes sense. We just don't do it. That's a slightly different question. And how do we get it all together? A lot of it's to do with IT. A lot of it's to basically make sure there's some alignment across departments and divisions. But that's the work we need to do. It's that quality planning piece of Duran's triad. We've got to do the quality planning. This is part of the quality planning. And so if we don't do that, the quality assurance and quality improvement is just basically sitting in their own silos. We hope you enjoyed our Quality Quest blog today. Tell us what you think of the patient Theme-ometer. Is there anything to add, or perhaps a fine adjustment? Leave your comments on Twitter or leave a blog reply on our website. We'll hopefully see you soon for our next blog.